Good morning, Dr. Farmer. My name is Robert Johnston, and I represent Monsanto in this litigation. We've met before, correct?
Yes.
I want to review your background and history with Monsanto. Can you tell us about your educational background, starting with college, please?
I have a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from the University of Colorado in Boulder in 1977. I have a PhD in Anatomy and Cell Biology. My area of research is mechanistic, reproductive, and developmental toxicology from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine, and I got that in 1982.
And as part of your graduate studies, did you take any classes in toxicology?
Yes, I did.
What sort of classes did you take in toxicology?
We had classes in the method of what toxicology is and the basic principles of toxicology. I had forensic pathology, and so they were very basic courses.
Did you do any research in toxicology as part of your PhD program?
Yes, I did. I was a mechanistic, reproductive, and developmental toxicologist, and what I was looking at is if I gave a pregnant animal a drug on a certain day, it caused a certain malformation, and I wanted to understand what was the mechanism by which that compound caused that particular defect in those offspring.
And these were animals that you were experimenting with?
I was working with rats.
Okay. I handed you a document that we've marked as Exhibit 1-56. Have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
Can you tell us what this document is?
This is the review of the EPA of glyphosate for its re-registration eligibility decision.
And do you know who wrote this document?
This would have been the EPA in their Office of Pesticide Programs. Probably a group of them probably put this all together because there's more than just toxicology, so the Human Health Effects Division would have been involved as well.
So the EPA wrote this document?
Yes.
As part of the re-registration eligibility decision for glyphosate, did EPA conduct a human health risk assessment?
Yes, it did. Let's
turn to the table of contents in the document here. On the page that's marked little I. Is this the table of contents that addresses part of the human health assessment that EPA did in 1993?
Yes.
And can you read through this list, and we have another page that we'll put up in a minute, and tell us what the EPA considered as part of its toxicology assessment?
They looked at acute toxicity, subchronic toxicity, chronic toxicity, carcinogenicity, developmental toxicity.
Okay, let me get the other page over here.
Reproductive toxicity, mutagenicity, metabolism, neurotoxicity, other toxicological endpoints, and a reference dose.
Okay. Did these studies include any studies that addressed cancer as an endpoint?
Yes, they did.
Okay. What kind of studies would that have been?
Those would have been long-term feeding studies in rodents.
And one of the topics here at D is carcinogenicity, correct?
Yes.
And what does carcinogenicity mean?
That means you're studying the development of cancer, the potential of a substance to cause cancer.
And in the sections of the red that are identified in this table of contents, did the EPA consider various studies that address those topics?
Yes, it did.
Including those studies looking at cancer endpoints?
Yes, they did.
I'd like you to turn now to page 57 of the red document. And you'll see a section called eligibility decision on that page.
Yes, I do.
Would you read the first paragraph for the jury under eligibility decision?
Based on the reviews of the generic data for the active ingredient glyphosate, the agency has sufficient information on the health effects of glyphosate and on its potential for causing adverse effects in fish and wildlife in the environment. The agency concludes that products containing glyphosate for all uses are eligible for re-registration.
And then can you read the paragraph below that, please?
The agency has determined that glyphosate products labeled and used as specified in this re-registration eligibility document will not pose unreasonable risks or adverse effects to humans or the environment.
Let me show you this document, which we're going to mark as Exhibit 157. And can you, have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
Can you tell us what this document is?
This is the report on the potential of glyphosate to cause cancer from the Cancer Assessment and Review Committee, which is a part of EPA.
And this is on EPA, US EPA letterhead, correct?
Yes, it is.
And this is a document prepared by an agency of the EPA?
Yes, it is, a committee of the EPA.
So, okay. Is this document still available on the EPA website?
Yes, it is.
And have you looked for it and found it on the EPA website?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So it is still a publicly available document that can be obtained from the EPA, correct?
Yes, it can.
Do you know what prompted the Cancer Assessment Review Committee to issue this report in October of 2015?
It was the IARC's monograph on glyphosate.
And in fact, if we turn to page 7 of this document, which is the executive summary, and even look at the last sentence on this page. Can you read that sentence for the jury, please?
The conclusion by IARC and the additional studies not available to OPP prompted the agency to reevaluate the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate.
And if we look on page 8, does that page provide us any information on what the CARC, the Cancer Assessment Review Committee, reviewed data-wise as far as this report? If we look at the third sentence in the paragraph that begins, the CARC also evaluated. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you read that to the jury, please?
The CARC also evaluated 11 chronic toxicity/carcinogenicity studies in rats, parentheses, 7 on parentheses, and mice, 4, following dietary administration for up to 2 years.
Okay, let's look at what the CARC said about carcinogenicity on page 9. There's a paragraph that starts overall.
Yes.
You see that? Can you read that, please?
Overall, the CARC concluded that there was no evidence of carcinogenicity in the 11 carcinogenicity studies conducted in Sprague Dawley or Wistar rats and CD1 mice. There were no treatment-related increases in the occurrence of any tumor type in either sex of either species.
So is that the opinion of the EPA's Cancer Assessment Review Committee issued in 2015?
Yes.
Do you know if did the Cancer Assessment Review Committee reach an overall conclusion regarding the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate?
Yes, they did.
Let's look on page 10 of this document. And you see above the bullet points,
Yes.
can you read the sentence that starts in accordance?
In accordance with the 2005 guidelines for carcinogen risk assessment, based on the weight of evidence, glyphosate is classified as not likely to be carcinogenic to humans.
Okay. And that conclusion was reached in October of 2015, correct?
Yes, it was.
And that was after the IARC had issued its report, correct?
Correct.
Has EPA issued any other documents since the CARC report in October of 2015 that evaluate the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate?
Yes, they have.
What document is that you're referring to?
The glyphosate issue paper by OPP.
Hand you a document that's been marked as Exhibit 158, titled Glyphosate Issue Paper, Evaluation of Carcinogenic Potential, EPA's Office of Pesticide Program, September 12th, 2016. Do you see that document?
Yes.
Have you seen that document before?
Yes, I have.
What is EFSA, by the way?
EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority. It is the agency similar to like an EPA that would look at and evaluate the safety of pesticides.
Do you know whether EFSA has evaluated the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate within the last few years?
Yes, they did.
Do you know when?
It was in 2015
And what did they conclude?
that it was not a carcinogenic hazard to humans.
What is the JPMR referenced in this document?
The JMPR is the Joint Meeting on Pesticide Residues. It's another program in the World Health Organization. It's a combination of the Food Agricultural Organization that looks at the residues and the World Health Organization that looks at the toxicology, and they evaluate the toxicology and the residues of pesticide products.
So the JPMR is part of the World Health Organization?
Yes, it is.
And the IARC is also part of the World Health Organization, correct?
Yes.
What did has JPMR evaluated the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate within the last few years?
They did in 2016.
And what did they conclude?
That it was not carcinogenic to humans.
So a different conclusion than the IARC concluded.
Yes.
Do you agree with the JPMR's conclusion?
Yes, I do.
What is the significance of their finding that tumors are not reproduced across studies?
If glyphosate really were a carcinogen and it really were developing those tumors, you would expect it every time to create those tumors, not just in one study and not in several other studies. So consistency is very important.
Has the potential association between Roundup exposure and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma been studied?
Yes.
Did EPA's CARC evaluate the epidemiological data regarding Roundup exposure and the NHL in its 2015 evaluation of glyphosate?
Yes, it did.
Did EPA's OPP evaluate the epidemiological data regarding an alleged association between glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in its 2016 publication?
Yes, they did.
Let's take a look at that document, which we've marked as Exhibit 1-58. And if you could look at page 140, please. Again, this is a publication by the EPA's Office of Pesticides program, right?
Yes.
Now, did the data that was reviewed by the OPP in 2016, did that include the epidemiology studies that Mr. Miller was asking you about yesterday?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Mr. Miller asked you about page 2 of this document.
Yes.
And he asked you about this sentence I'm pointing to here on the screen. There are now 6 published studies that arguably associate glyphosate and other pesticides with lymphopoietic cancers, 4-6, or adverse reproductive outcomes, 7-9. Do you see that?
Yes.
And he asked you whether those 6 studies all related to whether glyphosate could be associated with cancer. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do those 6 studies that are referenced in this paper all address the question of whether glyphosate is associated with cancer?
No.
How many of them do address whether glyphosate is associated with cancer?
Only 3 of them.
So of the 6, 3 do not address cancer, correct?
Correct. They address reproductive outcomes.
And the 3 that are addressed to cancer, were those considered by the EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs in its September 12th, 2016 report?
Yes, they were.
I want to have you look again at the document we've marked as 1-58 and turn to page 131, please. And we read part of this paragraph already, but do you see the paragraph above 6.4 that starts overall?
131. Overall.
Yeah, can you read down to, let's see, the 3rd sentence there?
Overall, there is remarkable consistency in the database for glyphosate across multiple lines of evidence. For NHL, observed associations in epidemiological studies were not non-statistically significant and were of relatively small magnitude. Chance and/or bias cannot be excluded as an explanation for the observed associations.
And do you agree with OPP's view of those epidemiological studies?
Yes.
And in fact, you had conveyed similar opinions to Mr. Miller when he was discussing some numbers that were contained in a press report of an unidentified epidemiological study yesterday, correct?
Yes.
What was the OPP's, well, a few minutes ago we read that the OPP's conclusion was that the strongest support is that glyphosate is not likely to be carcinogenic to humans. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Do you agree with that analysis by the OPP?
Yes.
Okay. Let's look at Exhibit 1-57 and look on page 9 again. The paragraph, the last full paragraph on the page that starts the CARC evaluated. Do you see that?
Yes. The CARC evaluated a total...
Just read through the citation, please. So,
Sorry. I'm sorry.
go ahead.
The CARC evaluated a total of 54 mutagenicity gene toxicity studies, which included studies submitted to the agency, as well as studies reported in the 2 review articles, Williams et al. 2000 and Kyer and Kirkland 2013.
All right. Now, so there were 54 mutagenicity genotoxicity studies considered by the CARC in 2015, right?
Yes.
Were any of those performed by Monsanto?
Yes.
Do you know how many?
I would assume they'd be the same 4 that we talked about in the red.
So who did the other, say, 50 studies?
Those would be the other registrants of glyphosate.
Okay. Okay, so I want to then go down to the sentence that starts the CARC based on. You see that in that paragraph?
Yes.
Can you read that, please?
The CARC, based on a weight of evidence of the in vitro and in vivo studies, concluded that there is no concern for genotoxicity or mutagenicity. Glyphosate was, no, it should be not mutagenic in bacterial aversion Ames assays or in vitro mammalian gene mutation assays. There is no convincing evidence that glyphosate induces micronuclei formation or chromosomal aberrations in vitro or in vivo.
Let me ask it again. Did the Office of Pesticides Program review studies on mutagenicity or genotoxicity in 2016?
Yes, they did.
Let's look at Exhibit 1-58 again and look at page 131. And you see the middle paragraph that starts over 80 genotoxicity. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you read the first 2 sentences of that paragraph too, please?
Over 80 genotoxicity studies with the active ingredient glyphosate were analyzed for the current evaluation. The overall weight of evidence indicates that there is no convincing evidence that glyphosate is genotoxic in vivo via the oral route.
And the 80 studies that OPP looked at, is that more or less than the CARC looked at in 2015?
More than the CARC.
Do you remember how many the CARC looked at?
54.
Do you agree with EPA's OPP that there's no convincing evidence that glyphosate is genotoxic in vivo via the oral route?
Yes.
All right, let's look again at the last sentence of this paragraph. It starts although some. You see that? Right here.
Oh, okay.
Can you read that, please?
Although some positive findings were reported for chromosomal alterations in vitro, these findings were limited to a few studies and are not supported by the in vivo studies that are the most relevant for human risk assessment.
Do you agree with that conclusion?
Yes.
And we read this earlier, but can you again read the last sentence above 6.4?
The genotoxicity studies demonstrate that glyphosate is not directly mutagenic or genotoxic in vivo.
So all three of the evaluations by EPA that we've talked about, the 1993 RED, the 2015 CARC report, and the 2016 OPP report, what was the conclusion of those reports regarding the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate?
That glyphosate was not carcinogenic to humans.
Have the surfactants that are used in Monsanto's glyphosate-based herbicides that are sold in the United States, have they been approved by the EPA?
Yes, they have.
What type of safety or toxicological data does EPA require for the approval of surfactants?
The EPA requires, before you put any inert ingredient into your pesticide formulation, they have to evaluate it for its safety. Many years ago, they didn't have a very extensive data set for the surfactants, but today they look for information on acute toxicity. They look for some information on subchronic studies. Is there anything on genotoxicity? They look for environmental fate. They look for some ecotox. So they look for a variety of information on the surfactants as well to make their determination of safety.
Marked a document as Exhibit 1-59 titled The Toxicity Profiles of 5 Surfactants Used in Roundup Branded Agricultural Herbicides. Have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
And who is the first author of this paper?
I am.
Can you tell me, was this document prepared in the ordinary course of Monsanto's business?
Yes, it was.
Okay, we'll move this document into evidence. Have you, do you recall what the conclusions of this paper were?
Yes, that the surfactants are, there's no concern for any toxicological effects for humans from the, or animals from these use of surfactants in our formulated products.
Now, you mentioned earlier that EPA has evaluated the surfactants that are used in Monsanto's U.S. formulations, correct?
Yes.
Let me show you a document that I'm going to mark as Exhibit 1-60. Have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
All right, and this is a document on U.S. Environmental Protection Agency letterhead, correct?
Yes, it is.
And the subject is words that I'm going to have trouble pronouncing, but I'll try. Alkylamine polycoxylates, JITF-CST4 inert ingredients, and then it goes on, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell me generally what this document is?
The EPA, under the Food Quality Protection Act, needed to go back and look at all of their inert ingredients and reassess them. And they were divided into what they called clusters. And this one, for this particular family of chemistry, the alkylamine polycoxylates, was the cluster 4. And the JITF is a joint industry task force that was formed to support this reevaluation. And it was made up of people like the agricultural companies who may be using those inerts in their products, or for the people who are then manufacturing those products.
And we've talked about this before, but remind us what the alkylamine polycoxylates are.
These are, so what we would find in here would be like the POEA, the polyoxyethylene alkylamines. So this was a name they kind of created to cover this bucket of, you can see there are different CAS numbers that are associated with the surfactants in here, but this is the bucket where many of our surfactants fall.
And the subject goes on to state, after the bolded portion, human health risk assessment to support proposed exemption from the requirement of a tolerance when used as an inert ingredients in pesticide formulations, correct?
Yes.
So is it correct that this document is a human health risk assessment of these surfactants?
Yes, it is.
If you look at page 4, please. Which is the executive summary of this document.
Mm-hmm.
You see I guess the third paragraph starts the toxicology database.
Yes.
Can you read that paragraph, please?
The toxicology database is adequate to support the use of the alkylamine polycoxylates when used as inert ingredients. The AAPs are not acutely toxic by the oral and dermal routes of exposure or via inhalation under normal use conditions. Concentrated materials are generally corrosive eye and skin irritants and may be dermal sensitizers. There is no evidence that the AAPs are neurotoxic, mutagenic, or clastogenic.
And we talked yesterday about what clastogenic means, but can you remind us what clastogenic means?
Again, it would be damage to the structural genetic material.
Okay. Do you agree with EPA that alkylamine polycarboxylates are not neurotoxic, mutagenic, or clastogenic?
Yes.
Did EPA reach a conclusion regarding the overall carcinogenic potential of these APPs, as they call them?
Yes, they did.
Let's look on page 15. And there's a section called 4.4, Classification of Carcinogenic Potential. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Can you please read that first sentence for the record?
There is no evidence that the AAPs are carcinogenic.
Do you agree with the EPA's conclusion that there's no evidence that APs are carcinogenic?
Yes.
Now, we've been talking about EPA's review of data on glyphosate and surfactants so far, correct?
Yes.
Has EPA reviewed any safety data on the formulated product itself, Roundup and other formulated products?
Yeah, we are required for all of our formulated products to conduct what we call the six-pack. It's acute oral, acute dermal, acute inhalation, skin and eye irritation, and a skin sensitization for all of our formulations.
So is that true of every version of glyphosate-based products sold in the United States?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Why are there different formulations sold in the United States?
Well, we have different manufacturers, for one, and then Monsanto, we also have different needs. We have an ITNO market, we have a consumer market, we have an agricultural market, so those formulations can be different. We also have some that have different the way that we can put in containers, so we have different salts that go along with them. We have different weed species that we have to deal with. So the formulated product is what you're looking at is what is the need to control the vegetation, what sector, and then you develop formulations to be efficacious in those groups.
And did I understand your testimony to be that for each of those formulations sold in the United States, you have to do what you called a six-pack of tests?
Yes, we do.
Have you been involved in the conduct of that six-pack of tests for U.S. formulations?
I have, yes.
What do those test results show generally?
For the Roundup branded products, that they are practically and slightly non-toxic. We have very little low acute dermal and inhalation toxicity. We have low eye and skin irritation, and that they are not sensitizers.
Has Monsanto done any testing other than or in addition to that six-pack testing on any formulated products?
We have done some gene tox testing on some of our formulated products.
Do you know how many genotox studies that Monsanto has undertaken on its formulated products, roughly?
I'd say a couple of dozen.
And is there any consistent results from those genotoxicity studies?
Those studies are conducted according to the guidelines that the regulatory agencies require us, and they have been no evidence of genotoxicity or mutagenicity.
Now, are those studies required by the EPA?
No, they're not.
Well, why would Monsanto do additional genotoxicity testing on its formulated products that is not required by the EPA?
We would have people asking about the profile, knowing that we know the surfactants are not genotoxic and that glyphosate isn't. We feel very comfortable that the formulated product would not be, but we would go ahead and do those studies according to the EPA's guidelines.
But why?
To answer questions if people have concerns. We want to be able to give them the data that they can have to evaluate the safety.
You remember yesterday Mr. Miller asked you some questions about a Dr. Perry from 1999 and 2000. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And he was a genotox expert that Monsanto worked with in that period?
Correct.
And he pointed out in several documents that Dr. Perry wanted Monsanto to conduct some additional genotoxicity studies.
Yes.
Did Monsanto ever conduct any of the sorts of studies that Dr. Perry was recommending?
Yes, we did. Dr. Perry was concerned about the findings from the Peluso and Bolognese studies, and so we did an in vivo study with the formulated product in those studies to evaluate and answer the questions that Dr. Perry was concerned about.
I've handed you a document that I've marked as Exhibit 1-61. Have you ever seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
And can you tell us what the title of this document is?
Genotoxic potential of glyphosate formulations, mode of action investigations.
And were you an author on this publication?
Yes, I was.
And was anyone else at Monsanto an author on this publication?
Yes, they were.
Okay. The lead author is William Heidens, correct?
Correct.
Was an article published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry in 2008, correct?
Yes.
Is the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry a peer-reviewed journal?
Yes, it is.
And can you tell us briefly or generally what was done in this paper?
The Bolognese and Peluso studies, their route of injection was to actually take a needle and inject the formulated product into the abdomen of the animals. And so we felt that would be, and as again we have a surfactant in there, so that would be like taking dishwashing detergent and sticking a needle in your abdomen and injecting it with the dishwashing detergent. And so we felt that if you did a relevant route of exposure under normal human conditions, such as an oral exposure, that you would not see the same findings that you saw in this study, that we felt that the findings in the study were because the material was injected into the abdomen and directly injured the liver and the kidney that were the two organs in this particular study. And when we did it via the real-world normal route of exposure orally, we didn't see any of the results that we saw. And so in here they talked about the oxidative stress. And what we found is when you inject it into the abdomen, again, directly into the abdomen, the animals, you actually had test material that was sitting on those organs and actually damaged those organs. And the oxidative stress that you saw afterwards, those cells of those organs were damaged directly. And that was then how you got the oxidative stress. When it was through the oral way, which is the more natural way, real-world exposure, we didn't find any effect on the organs, and we didn't find any oxidative stress. So the oxidative stress then is related to that direct toxic effect on the cells of those organs.
All right, let me make sure I understand that. Did you replicate the practice or the methodology of injecting formulated product into the abdomens of animals?
We reproduced their studies, yes.
And did you find the same results that their studies found when you followed that methodology?
Yes, we did.
Did you also inject surfactants without glyphosate into those animals?
We took a formulation where we took the glyphosate out but had exactly the same formulation, injected that into the animals, and we saw the exact same result that we saw with the fully loaded formulation.
So if you only injected surfactants, you had the same results as if you had injected the full formulated product with glyphosate?
Correct.
Okay. And in those tests, you found oxidative stress to the cells, correct?
Yes, we did.
And then you also provided formulated product via oral administration?
Yes, an oral.
And did you find any oxidative stress when you used that method of administration?
No, we did not, and that was a fully loaded formulation.
And so what is your conclusion about what that means with respect to the potential for glyphosate to cause oxidative stress when used in the real world?
In the real world, you won't have that direct exposure to the cells that you had with that injection into the abdomen to directly impact those organs. You won't have that route of exposure from the oral route.
And this is a paper that Monsanto employees and others put together to show those findings, correct?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about exposure, since we were just talking about it. How are people exposed to glyphosate in using Monsanto's formulated products?
You can think about potentially in normal use of the product or from food that is derived. You can have it from a dermal exposure, you could have it potentially from an inhalation exposure, and you could have it from an oral exposure.
And has Monsanto studied what happens to glyphosate in the body via those various exposure mechanisms?
There are a number of studies that have looked at applicators who are applying the product. We've looked at what we call in their breathing zone to see if we can detect any level of glyphosate. And then we've also looked at two ways to look at it. One is biomonitoring by the glyphosate might be absorbed through the skin. We look at it in the urine and see what might be the internal exposure they saw.
Okay, I'm going to mark as Exhibit 1-62 a study or a paper published in Environmental Health Perspectives in March of 2004 titled Glyphosate Biomonitoring for Farmers and Their Families, Results from the Farm Family Exposure Study. Have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
Can you generally tell me what you understand this document to be?
We had, as I talked about earlier, we had studies from applicators that were doing applications like in forestry or in orchards and other areas, but we didn't have any direct data on farmers and their families. And so this was a study that was put together with a task force from Crop Life America. It was called the Farm Family Exposure Task Force, and they were doing this farm family exposure study. And actually the head of the study was at the University of Minnesota. And what they did is they went out and they recruited families. For 48 families, they had to have a spouse that would be willing to do this and their children. And so they had 48 farmers and their spouses and their children, and they agreed to give urine samples, 24-hour urine samples, the day before an application, the day of an application, and then 3 days after the application. And so then what we did is then we looked at the level of glyphosate in their urine.
And the first author on this study is John Aquavella, correct?
Yes, it is.
And who is John Aquavella, or who was he at the time this was published?
John Aquavella was an epidemiologist at Monsanto.
So he was a Monsanto employee at this time?
Yes, he was.
Is he still a Monsanto employee?
No, he's retired.
Okay. So can you tell me what the results were as far as detectable glyphosate in the farmers and the wives and their children?
They were all extremely low. I think we had talked about this yesterday, that we improved our analytical method so that we went from a 10 part per billion limit of detection to a 1 part per billion limit of detection. And what we actually found is that 40% at that 1 part per billion, which would be like one drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, we found that 40% of the farmers, even though they had done applications on many acres, they had no detection of glyphosate in their urine. And we had one gentleman who had the highest exposed, and he was at 233 ppb, which was equivalent to 0.004 milligrams per kilogram per day. We had some spouses, two spouses had...
Let me ask you this. So that was for the farmers.
That was for the farmers.
Were the results similar for the spouses as
No.
far as the levels they were exposed to?
No,
Okay, tell me
not at all.
about that.
There were only two spouses that had something around the limit of detection. So that was extremely low. And I should point out that the gentleman was at 233 ppb, but the geometric mean, the mean across all the farmers was 3 ppb. So it was extremely low. And then the children, we had about 12% that had detectable glyphosate in their urine, and the maximum was 29 ppb. Unfortunately, that was the child of the parent with the 233 ppb. And for all the children that had detects, except for one, we could place them being co-applicators with their parents, actually working in the mixing and applicating area. I think the important thing about this is the highest detected person in this was the one farmer at the 233 ppb, or 0.004 milligrams per kilogram. And if you put that into perspective, the reference dose for glyphosate from EPA was 2 milligrams per kilogram per day. So we can see that even the highest exposed is extremely well below any level of concern.
How does EPA determine what the reference dose is? Do you know?
Yes, I do. They take what's called a no observed adverse effect level for a relevant study, and then they say we're going to take an uncertainty factor of 10 for differences between species and 10 among species. Gives you an uncertainty factor of 100. So they divide that NOEL by that 100, and that will give you your reference dose. And with glyphosate, they had a no observed adverse effect level from our rabbit teratology study, which was 175 milligrams per kilogram. They divided that by 100, and then they rounded it up to 2 milligrams per kilogram.
And did any of the exposure studies in the glyphosate database done by Monsanto show any exposures above EPA's reference dose of 2 milligrams per kilogram per day?
No.
Dr. Farmer, thank you so much for your time this morning and for yesterday. I have one last question, and then we'll turn it back over to the Plaintiffs' Counsel. Going back to Exhibit 1.8 that was marked yesterday, going back to this sentence that was highlighted, or this, you cannot say that Roundup does not cause cancer. What did you mean when you said you cannot say that Roundup does not cause cancer?
When you looked, I was responding to number 2 below in the answer, where it said in long-term exposure studies of animals, Roundup did not cause cancer. We have not conducted long-term exposure studies in Roundup, but we have conducted that with glyphosate.
So the issue here was that they had used the word Roundup, the brand name, rather than the name the word glyphosate, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Had they said glyphosate has been shown in long-term studies not to cause cancer, what would you have said?
I would have said that was perfectly fine.
Okay.
Good morning.
Michael Miller, we had a chance to visit yesterday. I have a few follow-up questions, okay?
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, this morning, counsel for Monsanto asked you a series of questions, and I'm here to follow up on them, okay?
Okay.
And he started out with exhibits 157, I believe. I'm sorry, 156 was a registration eligibility decision about glyphosate, right?
Yes.
And then 157, which was another document from the EPA in October 2015 about glyphosate, right?
Yes.
And then in 2016, Exhibit 158 was an exhibit about glyphosate, right?
Yes.
Now you understand, none of the clients who are claiming non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in this case were exposed to glyphosate. They were exposed to the formulant, that is to say, glyphosate plus the surfactant. That's the allegation, right? Roundup.
I know that I think if we talked about this before, they talk about in there that glyphosate is not a carcinogen, and then you looked at the cluster 4 that talked about the surfactants, and the EPA made a determination that they weren't concerned about carcinogenicity, that there wasn't a carcinogenic potential for the surfactants. So if you have 2 substances and the third one is water, both carcinogenic, there is no reason to believe that Roundup is then going to be carcinogenic.
You remember Exhibit 1:8, right, ma'am?
Yes.
You cannot say that Roundup does not cause cancer, right?
Again, we can put that back into context as we were talking about that it's below. It's in response to the sentence below that says, in long-term studies of animals, Roundup does not cause cancer. We haven't done long-term studies with Roundup, but again, it doesn't mean that Roundup doesn't cause cancer. We can take a look at both the glyphosate as the active ingredient and the surfactants together.
What it means is what you've said on this document in Exhibit 1:8 in September 21st, 2009 at 5:12 in the afternoon, that we have not done carcinogenicity studies with Roundup. We, meaning Monsanto, have not done carcinogenicity, means studies to see if it causes cancer. That's what that means, right?
We haven't done carcinogen studies with Roundup, as I said below. It's responding to that statement in long-term exposure studies of animals to Roundup. Roundup did not cause cancer. And as I said before, we have got carcinogenicity studies in glyphosate, and EPA, there in 3 different documents, has concluded that glyphosate is not carcinogenic. And in the Cluster 4 document, they also concluded that the surfactants are not carcinogenic. So even though we don't have long-term studies on Roundup, we can take a look, and we have evidence that the 2 of them together, that Roundup would not be carcinogenic.
Let's see if we can get a simple answer to a simple question. Exhibit 156 in 1993 was a submission on glyphosate, not Roundup. True?
There were formulated products in there, but the basic is about the re-registration eligibility of glyphosate.
All right. And it's also true, ma'am, that Exhibit 157, which your counsel showed you, was an exhibit submitted to the EPA, reported to the EPA about glyphosate, not about Roundup. True?
That's about glyphosate, yes.
All right. And then he showed you a big, thick report from the EPA Office of Pesticide Programs, Exhibit 158. It's about glyphosate, not Roundup, right?
It's about glyphosate, yes.
Okay. Now, you understand, though, that IARC studied and reported on Roundup, not glyphosate. They reported on both, right?
They made their determination of glyphosate being a carcinogen.
Yes, ma'am. A probable human carcinogen for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, right?
That's what the IARC concluded, yes.
Yes, ma'am. And you mentioned that before the EPA issued their report on glyphosate, they looked at, I think you said about 50-some studies? Or how many studies? How many studies did they look at?
I don't understand which studies either in which report.
Exhibit 157. I believe it says on page 8, let's look at it. Let's be precise. Let's take our time. We're not going to worry about flights. We're going to be precise. All right, page 8. Okay. Counsel even highlighted this for you. Okay. He said that this report on glyphosate, not Roundup, but glyphosate, it says the CARC, the CARC, I think Monsanto's lawyer called it. CARC looked at 25 case control studies. They evaluated 11 chronic studies, 7 rat studies, and 4 mice studies. Does that sound right?
That's what it says there, yes.
Okay. You're aware that when IARC looked at Roundup, they looked at 1,000 studies, man?
I don't remember that. That was not just Roundup they looked at. They looked at a lot of studies. But again, when you look at the studies, they didn't have the animal studies. They were looking at gene tox studies on Roundup that were in irrelevant animal models, irrelevant routes of exposure, high doses. It's a very different data set that they were looking at.
Let's take a look at Exhibit 165 to see how many studies IARC looked at, ma'am. Here you go. So here's a copy for you and a copy for counsel. There you go. This is from IARC, World Health Organization, question and answers on glyphosate. You've seen this before, haven't you?
Yes.
Okay. And what IARC is telling us that in March of 2015, IARC classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. Okay. And I'm going to go over a couple points, but one is to reach these conclusions, IARC reviewed how many studies, Dr. Farmer?
It said 1,000 studies, but again, when they looked at those studies, they didn't do any evaluation of relevancy, strength, exposure routes. They looked at 1,000 studies, but not all of them were applicable, and not all of them were really very good studies to address the questions that they were asking.
And they found strong evidence of genotoxicity in Roundup, right? That's what they report.
That's what IARC reports.
Tell the jury what genotoxicity means.
Genotoxicity, again, is effects on the genetic material.
And then they were very clear in March of 2016. Could the carcinogenic effect of glyphosate be related to other chemicals in the formulation? No. And to be clear, let's go to page 2, Doctor. IARC studied pure glyphosate as well as the glyphosate-based formulations, right?
They did look at glyphosate, and they did look at studies with the glyphosate-based formulations. But again, I would like to add in context those glyphosate-based formulation studies that had many of the, what they're looking at as positive findings, were in non-standard studies. They were in irrelevant routes of exposure. They were at high doses. And again, the results of those are not related to a genotoxic effect. It's really secondary to toxicity.
In this question and answer regarding their findings on glyphosate, IARC says that one of the key studies evaluated in the monograph was the United States Agricultural Health Study. This study did not find an association between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and glyphosate. Can this study alone outweigh the positive associations found in the other epidemiological studies?
This is...
I won't interrupt you, I promise. Don't interrupt me. I want to read the answer and then I have a question, please. All right, thank you, ma'am. The Agricultural Health Study has been described as the most powerful study, but this is not correct. You agree with these 17 scientists that in fact the AHS study is not the most powerful study?
I don't know what the basis for why they're not making that, why they're making that statement.
Remember, you wrote back on Exhibit 143 years before IARC wrote their report about Roundup in 1999. You wrote, we looked at yesterday, many groups have been highly critical of the study, this is the Agricultural Health Study, as being flawed. You remember writing that?
I do, but that here you're asking the question from this Q&A from the IARC that says they're saying the Agricultural Health Study has been described as the most powerful study, but this is not correct. And then they go on to say the weakness of the study is that people were followed up for a short period of time, which means there were fewer cases of cancer would have come to appear. So that has nothing to do with this particular question and answer from this one about not being the most powerful study.
What the working group tells us is the IARC working group also conducted an objective statistical analysis of the results of all the available studies on glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which concluded that the AHS and all of the case control studies, the data from all the studies combined show a statistically significant association between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and exposure to glyphosate. That is, in fact, what they show, isn't it, Dr. Farmer?
No, I would disagree with that. Again, you heard earlier from the EPA reports that those studies were confounded. They were confounded with bias and recall. The increases were not statistically significant, and that the increase was just slight, and that these studies all had inherent weaknesses in them.
And I think the jury's going to want to hear the answer to this question. How come IARC says it probably causes cancer and some regulatory agencies say it doesn't cause cancer? And IARC responded to that question on page 3, didn't they, ma'am?
I haven't seen this document, so...
Well, let's look at it. Regulatory agencies have reviewed the key studies examined by IARC and more, and concluded that glyphosate poses no unreasonable risk to humans. What did IARC do differently? And they answer this for us. Many regulatory agencies rely primarily on industry data from toxicology studies that are not available in the public domain. And that's what happens, right? The EPA looks at your private data that no one else is allowed to look at but Monsanto and the EPA. That is exactly what happened, isn't it?
IARC had available to it. They did get some documents from the EPA, but the data, the biggest data set on glyphosate is with the EPA. And those are studies that are required by registrants to provide to the EPA. And it's based on the reason why that IARC doesn't look at those. It's based on their own rules and regulations. And they had availability to look at the BFR, and they chose not to, which would have looked at all those industry studies. And so I think that there's a very strong difference here, why they are different. IARC doesn't want to look at those studies. The agencies look at those studies and everything else that IARC did. And again, they look at whether these 1,000 citations are of quality studies or not. IARC doesn't have a process where they rule out studies by irrelevant routes of exposure, animals that aren't relevant to humans, etc.
I think you hit the nail on the head. EPA looks at studies from industry. IARC looks at studies in the public domain. That's where we get a difference.
And the EPA looks at all of that in the public domain as well. They looked at all of those studies from all of the registrars. They looked at all of the data in the open literature. And then when they reviewed that, they asked for the relevancy of it. And so they actually looked at more than IARC did because they looked at all of those studies as well as the same studies in the open literature that IARC did.
And, ma'am, we looked at Exhibit 157. They looked at a whopping 53 studies, and IARC looked at 1,000. Isn't 1,000 more than 53? Let's go back. This is Exhibit 157. Your counsel showed you on glyphosate in the EPA report, and we're going to page 8, and it says his CARC committee examined one cohort study, 7 nested case control studies, 25 case control studies, also evaluated 11 chronic toxicity carcinogenicity studies in rats 7 and mice 4. That certainly doesn't add up to 1,000, does it?
Well, let's go back and look again what's in this 1,000. In this 1,000 are also looking at exposure, because remember there were the different groups. So they had studies that looked at the chemical, that looked at exposure, that looked at animal studies, that looked at gene tox, that looked at epidemiology. The EPA, when they do their reviews, they look at all of those studies, and they did a systematic review, and it's even in their document that talks about it, even though that they didn't number them. They did look, and I think there is a citation we can find for the EPA that all that they looked at. But that is specifically talking about CARC. And here, they're not telling you how many animal studies they looked at. They're not telling you how many gene tox studies they looked at. They're not telling you how many epidemiology. They're just saying 1,000 citations. So these aren't all related to carcinogenicity and genotoxicity.
I didn't say all 1,000 studies were, but let's find some. I think we find common ground here, Dr. Farmer. You agree that industry studies that are not in the public domain are not subject to the same scrutiny as studies that are in the public domain, right?
I would disagree with you. I would say they're open to even more scrutiny, even though it's not in the same peer review that you think, as we talked about, peer review is not the same all the time. Those studies EPA requires us to conduct. They have very specific protocols by which we have to conduct them and guidelines, right down to the temperature and the humidity in the room. EPA then has access to all of that data, to the raw data, and they look to see if we have met what is required of them. So it goes under a very rigorous peer review by the EPA scientists themselves, and they have data, access to all the data that they can even do reevaluation on if they choose to.
Look, in the interest of transparency, I'm again reading from the question and answers produced by IARC. In the interest of transparency, IARC evaluations rely only on data that are in the public domain and available for independent scientific review. Industry studies that don't get into the public domain aren't available for independent scientific review, are they?
Well, I would disagree with you on that, because the EPA scientists are the ones who are doing that independent review. Those studies are required by us. So in addition to not only what the EPA looks at, we also look at those out in the open literature. And in addition, there have been publications put out there. If you look at the Williams in 2000, that has summaries of our studies that were out there. You look at the Grime paper, there are summaries of those studies that are out there. But I would disagree with you that the regulatory studies that we submit aren't undergoing independent scientific review. Those are the EPA scientists that are doing those very critical, extensive reviews.
How many EPA scientists have been hired by Monsanto when they left EPA?
I don't know.
Now, you went to work with Mary Matheson the minute she left the EPA, right? Manavusin, you know who she is, Mary Manavusin?
I know she was with the EPA and she's now with Exponent.
Yeah, and she does work for Monsanto now, doesn't she?
Again, we're talking about independent scientific review of these studies when we submit them to the regulatory agency. Those are EPA employees that are doing those reviews at that time.
My question was, has Mary gone to work for Exponent from the EPA, and Exponent and Mary now do work for Monsanto? That is true, isn't it, ma'am?
I am not aware. Some people may be working with Mary, but I am not.
Exponent works with Monsanto, right?
Yes, we do work with Exponent.
And she works at Exponent.
That's my understanding. She does, yes.
Right. And you know Jess Rowland real well, don't you?
I don't know Jess Rowlands at all.
You know who he is?
I know he was with EPA and he was the chair of the park committee.
Where is he now?
My understanding is he's retired.
Is he offered to do any consultant work for Monsanto?
I'm not aware of anything.
Have you emailed him since he's left the EPA?
I never even emailed him before he left the EPA.
Who was the contact with Jess Rowland at Monsanto?
We have our Reg Affairs managers in the Washington, D.C. office. That would have been Dan Jenkins, to my understanding.
All right, ma'am. So, in the interest of transparency, IARC evaluations rely on data that are in the public domain and available for independent scientific review. The IARC working group evaluation of glyphosate included any industry studies that met this criteria. So if you had studies that were in the public domain, IARC says they're willing to look at them, right?
They did. Mm-hmm. That's what they said.
All right. With this material reviewed by the working group, there was enough evidence to conclude that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic to humans, right?
Yeah, I would like to go back up to a statement up here. However, they said that the IARC working group of glyphosate included any industries that met these criteria. However, they did not include data from summary tables, online supplements to published articles, and which did not provide enough detail for an independent assessment. This was the case with some of the industry studies of cancer experimental animals. And I would argue that some of the studies that they included in their review actually were less quality than the studies they had available to them.
But in the interest of transparency, they would not review them.
Well, what I'm saying is they reviewed some studies that actually were inadequate. I think that we had some studies. They said some of these they didn't review on the experimental animals because it didn't meet their criteria. I would argue that those studies had more information than some of the ones that they did include.
You testified that glyphosate went off patent in the year 2000?
Yes.
And
in the U.S.
In the United States, yes, ma'am. You further testified that there are other manufacturers down the United States that have registered with EPA?
Yes.
Okay. But Monsanto is still the largest seller of glyphosate in America, true?
I don't know if we're the largest or not. I know we're one of many.
You agree that the patent, that the generic version has to be identical to the patent version?
They have to meet specifications, yes.
With this 40-year data history that Monsanto has on glyphosate, has Monsanto sold that data to other companies that want to make glyphosate?
We have given them access to some of our data, yes.
Do you think that the CARC opinion on glyphosate issued right after IARC reached their opinion was political?
No.
Why not?
The CARC, the IARC had a different opinion of glyphosate. Glyphosate is undergoing registration renewal in the U.S., so it prompted them to go back and to look at all the data. And I think that that's what they did. They did a scientific evaluation.
You looked at Exhibit 161 and some emails from Dr. Sorhan, who was emailing you live from the IARC meetings in March of 2015. You remember that line of questions?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I have a couple of follow-ups. What Dr. Sorhan told you was that it was a unanimous vote, right? IARC voted unanimously. Here we go. Let's do this. There you go. Exhibit copy. All right, Dr. Farmer. You knew from Dr. Sorhan emailing you live from IARC that it was a unanimous vote. This was a vote in with no votes against, right?
Again, but you're going to the very bottom of this. The point of his email was that the animal group had changed their recommendation, and that, yes, at the very end, that was everyone voted for it.
Unanimous. Everyone agreed 17-0 that Roundup was a probable human carcinogen for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, right?
No, that's not what he's saying they voted for here. They were talking about the final recommendation as sufficient. And that appears to me that they were talking about that was for the animal group, not what you just talked about.
You know for a fact that the vote was 17-0. There was not one dissenting vote in IARC for the final vote that Roundup was a probable human carcinogen for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There was no dissenting vote.
I understand that, but again, there are a lot of people who completely disagree with IARC, and we've talked about that for 2 days.
We talked about your BlackBerry, and this email indicates that you will have received my earlier BlackBerry email. We don't have the BlackBerry emails from Dr. Sorhan. Will you agree to provide them and discuss that with counsel? Did you receive BlackBerry emails from Dr. Sorhan as this email suggests?
I have no idea what that difference would be. I assume they would be in my... I didn't get him... I think what he's saying is his BlackBerry forwarded the emails to our email, not that we had something separate.
Counsel for Monsanto showed you Exhibit 1-59, an article that you wrote with other employees from Monsanto, right?
Yes.
To be clear, this article has never been published in peer-reviewed literature, right?
We did put out a poster on it, and that would have been publicly available. And it is right now, my understanding, being put into a publication.
Has it been accepted for publication?
No, but it was accepted for a presentation at a scientific meeting, and we could get you that poster.
How many journals rejected this article?
It hasn't been submitted yet. It's in the process of being written up, and my understanding is it's going to be submitted somewhere.
What year was it written?
It was written over a period of time. That's the draft from 2008.
It was written in 2008, and here we are 8 years later, and it's never been accepted for publication.
Well, if you look at that, in 2000, and I think it was around 9, the cluster came through, and so we put some hold off until they had their cluster evaluation, because some of this data was included in that evaluation.
You talked a lot about regulatory agencies at the government, United States, and how they, if you agreed with them, if they agreed with you. What you didn't talk about was the National Toxicology Program. Have you heard of it?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what the National Toxicology Program is.
It's a U.S. government agency. That's just what it says. It's a national toxicology program. They conduct toxicology studies and look at toxicology of various substances.
And you found out that the National Toxicology Program in the summer of 2016 was going to look in and investigate this finding that IARC had made, that Roundup was a probable human carcinogen. You found out about the NTP going to do their own investigation, didn't you?
I know the NTP was going to do some investigations, but I don't think it was directly related to exactly what you said. I think there were some more specific studies that they were going to conduct.
And let's take a look at this last exhibit that I have. Exhibit sticker number. Exhibit 1-66, which I hope will be the last exhibit to your deposition here in the next few days. A series of emails with you and others about the National Toxicology Program, and let's take a look at it. Let me know when you're ready. I have a few questions. I have one more exhibit after this, and then we'll wrap up. But okay, have you had a chance to look at it?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole line of emails in which you're included in a lot of them, we'll look at which ones are about, and from September of 2016, subject matter, NTP will be evaluating glyphosate now, exclamation point. See that? Okay. So it was important enough, at least for your colleague from Crop Life, to put an exclamation point behind the concept that the National Toxicology Program was going to be looking into the fact that IARC had concluded Roundup was a probably human carcinogen. It was an important issue, wasn't it?
Yes, they indicate that they think it is an important issue, yes.
And so she emails you and says, this is something that is going to need some communication at the Hill level. She's talking about Capitol Hill, isn't she?
I would assume so. Again, I'm not a government affairs person. I'm the toxicologist, and so she would be working with that. So I assume that's what she's referring to.
Well, whatever she did at the Hill, the National Toxicology Program abandoned its research and its study on that issue. You're aware of that, aren't you?
I don't believe that NTP is stopped. I think they still have a program that is going to be ongoing, as far as I know.
When is their report going to be complete, do you know?
The NTP, they haven't even started their studies yet. From what I understand, they're in discussion about the kind of studies and aware of surfactants and how they have impact in studies. So I don't know when it will be available.
Your email at the bottom of the page here on this issue from Donna Farmer, in July of 2001. And you had just found out that Don Strump from WIL, now Charles River, some fellow you talked to at the teratology meetings this week, he told me he's been selected as a new member of the NTB board. Who is he, Don Strump?
He is a toxicologist at what was WIL. It's a contract lab.
Oh, I see.
And he's a teratologist by training.
All right, so he would be a new member of the board. That would be something important for the crop life people to know about?
Well, in the sense that if you want to know how the NTP works, would it be an opportunity for him to be able to, and that was my conversation with him, is would it be an opportunity that we could then talk with NTP and understand what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, just to have a contact.
If you look at the NTP slide deck, the proposal appears to be an extension of the IARC monograph. They appear to have accepted IARC's opinion that glyphosate and its formulations display two characteristics of carcinogens, genotoxicity and oxidative stress, that Ivan Rusin and Christopher Portier worked so hard to create and have been saying in public for months, because this is an area they propose to do research. Now that's a mouthful, but I have a few questions on that. How did you get access to the NTP slide decks? Are they publicly available?
Yes.
I see. All right. And by meaning they appear to have accepted the IARC's opinion that glyphosate and its formulations display two key characteristics of carcinogens, genotoxicity and oxidative stress. Just to be clear, those are the same two characteristics of carcinogen that Dr. Perry told you about in 1999, aren't they?
Again, we've talked about this, that the studies that we see, oxidative stress and the gene toxicity that we've talked about both with IARC and with Professor Perry, are not due to standard studies. They're due to irrelevant routes of exposure. They're due to high-dose exposures. They're due to many other aspects. And so as we talked about, we were able to show Dr. Perry that when you do a normal route of exposure in real world, you don't then see those characteristics. And so, yeah, my point here is that what I'd like to do is have them see the basis of the quality of those studies that those determinations were made from, because I don't believe, again, that it's applicable to these products.
Very well. But on the issues that I asked about, you're not an epidemiologist and you're not an oncologist.
As we discussed, again, science is multifaceted, multidisciplinary. A lot of people have a different area of expertise, and that's why we have different scientists that work with us.
In To stop the NTP from issuing a report, you decided to challenge them both scientifically and politically?
Me personally, I think scientifically we sure can. I don't know about the political part.
Let me rephrase my question. Monsanto decided to challenge the NTP scientifically and politically, right?
I know scientifically, I'm not aware of the political aspects, no.
Who's Michael Cook?
That is the head of the group that I'm in.
That's it. All right. All right, last exhibit, and we're going to get this man on his plane on time. All right?
I need you to show me the OPP exhibit, please.
Sure.
Can I ask you to please look at page 21 of this report, which has been marked as exhibit 1.
I'll put it for you.
Yeah, 1.58, just show the sticker.
Okay.
You see that page?
Yes.
You see the paragraph after the search terms? That starts after cross-referencing?
Yes.
Do you remember we talked earlier about the fact that they had indicated they'd looked at literature as part of the OPP report?
Yes, I do.
Okay, can you read for the jury what that paragraph says, starting with after cross-referencing?
After cross-referencing the results obtained from the 3 open literature searches for duplicates, a total of 735 individual articles were obtained in Appendix A, and 1 additional study, Alvarez-Moya 2014, not identified in the search, was added to this list for a total of 736 individual articles. All the studies were evaluated to determine if the study would be considered relevant to the issue of concern, i.e. human carcinogenic potential of glyphosate. Many of the articles were not considered to be within the scope of the search or not considered relevant in general, 658 articles. Additionally, 27 articles were not appropriate due to the type of article, i.e. correspondence, abstract only, not available in English, retraction. Of the 51 relevant articles, 42 were used in the current evaluation, 31 genotoxicity, 9 epidemiological, and 2 animal carcinogenicity. 3 articles also report on the potential of glyphosate and its metabolites to be developed into therapeutic drugs for cancer treatment. The remaining 6 articles evaluated effects on glyphosate or glyphosate formulations on cellular processes, mostly focusing on epidermal cells, and were not considered informative for the current evaluation.
So does this document indicate that the EPA's OPP had considered 736 articles as part of its review?
Yes, it did.
And in addition, they considered under 2.12 studies submitted to the agency, correct?
Yes, they did.
Okay.